My name is Siddharth Gandhi. I'm from One Cosmos and I am the COO for APAC. I think the last few years have been very interesting in terms of how things are shaping up in the digital era, especially in the healthcare. When we speak about healthcare and its supply chain, it includes the hospitals, which is customer facing, patient facing. And then, of course, as part of the supply chain, you also have all your innovator companies which are producing the medicines or the drugs that are required. I think across the board in the last few years, there have been increasing number of breaches. Not just on the customer front. I think in India, we've seen one of the largest breaches in terms of healthcare records, but also globally. And even in the supply chain, what it amounts to is not just loss of data of patients, but also intellectual property rights within the supply chain, where innovator companies are spending billions and billions of dollars to develop a drug over years, right? It's not just months, but over years, which means that the impact is very significant, not just in terms of monetary loss, but also loss of trust, because at the end of the day, if I'm a patient and if my data and my healthcare records are out there, I would be very worried. The threat landscape and the attack vector has become very significant now. So for a enterprise to be able to manage what the threat landscape looks like is not an easy job. Right? So one needs to be able to invest in the right places, and we are seeing increasing number of spend across the board from the various healthcare supply chain service providers as well, including how do we protect data of customers, how do I protect my intellectual property, what are the tools and systems that are going to ensure that my data is safe, right? Because when you talk about risk, right, risk has a couple of components within it in terms of how safe the data is, right, including customer information, my IP information, where do I store it, who has access to it, why they need access to it, and at what period in time do they need it, right? And last but not the least, where do I store that data? We are talking of digital transformation, where people are talking about cloud adoption, right? So if I want to store my data on the cloud, is it safe on the cloud or not? If I want to do it on-prem, I still need a protection to be able to safeguard that data within my premise as well. Data Privacy Act has a few core principles, right, in terms of how the data is collected, how the data is processed, how the data is stored, and within that supply chain of these three things, how do you bring in accountability and transparency? Now, between these four principles, effectively, we are talking about from the customer data or internal information of the enterprise, all the service providers within that, right? It's not just supply chain related, which means your IT vendors, your outsourced service providers, right? India today is the outsourcing capital for the world, right? We have significant amount of players in India who are providing healthcare outsourcing arms based out of India in Hyderabad and Bangalore, etc. So how do they manage that data? How do they access that information, right? And that is the key aspect that needs to be now addressed, and to ensure that what kind of assurance level you are bringing to the table for your patients, your customers, to bring in and telling them that your data, when we are managing it, is safeguarded. One Cosmos has been an early pioneer in the whole identity-based authentication space, right? Identity and access management is only 20 years old. But if you look at the authentication from the advent of computers, the credentials, which is user ID and password, have been around for 60 years, right? What we bring to the table is an innovative way of authenticating, which is passwordless, right? However, passwordless is only a feature. What I think the crux is in an increasing digital world, and all enterprises are talking about digital transformation, is how identity is managed. What One Cosmos brings to the table, and we are now about 5 years old. We've been talking about this for the last 4-5 years once we came out of our stealth mode. And we've been advocating biometric based authentication, how you onboard identity. Right? If you think about it, there is no association between a digital identity and a real world identity. What we bring to the table is unique, where we are associating different factors which really prove who you are, right? And if you've proven an identity, then you can use that identity in different ways and forms. And one of the ways is passwordless. From a healthcare standpoint, you're talking about safeguarding data of the customers, because if the customer is interacting in a digital way, you have your telemedicines coming in and bunch of other service providers that are leveraging the digital transformation to provide services. But how do you interact with the customer? How do you build that trust with the customer to say that the person who's logging in is who he or she claims to be? So if you verify the identity of your customer, you're then going to allow him into your application to interact with. And also at the same time, you need to return back to the customer with an assurance and a trust factor that the data that they are going to be parting with, their PII information or personally identifiable information, is going to be safe, right? So at the back end, you're then also bringing in various capabilities of ensuring that the enterprise, the way data and information is managed, is safeguarded, right? So that is how passwordless authentication works, right? If you don't have credentials, there's nothing to steal at the end of the day, right? And it can also bring in a couple of other things in terms of verified identity. What OneCosmos has is a crypto wallet, which makes it interoperable, right? Which means that if I am today interfacing with healthcare service provider A and I want to share it with healthcare service provider B, I can do it based on consent, right? That's where the whole privacy aspect also comes in, that at any given point in time, if I want to share my information, it's going to take my consent as an individual before it can be shared with anybody else, right? So it becomes a user control identity. And that is what really differentiates OneCosmos, and we've been pioneers in this space for the last few years. So we've been working with a few healthcare customers in terms of addressing their needs. Like I said, one of the key aspects in India that we are interfacing with healthcare service providers is, one, how to protect their IP, right? Because in a lot of cases, mobile phones are not allowed. One of the ways in which we are able to provide passwordless is through a mobile app. But in a secure environment, mobile phones are not allowed. What we very recently introduced is an additional capability, which remains an identity-based approach of authentication, is a hardware biometric key, where the user can still provide their biometric to prove who they are before they are able to get access to any enterprise application. So in such cases, we are able to use a great way, an extended way or a different way of authenticating, which is still secure. On the customer side, we are working to have insurance companies, right? They are also part of the supply chain, where customers need to interact with these healthcare service provider from an insurance standpoint to claim their insurance. Even over there, the PII information is pretty critical and significant, right? Which means that if you lose your credentials over there, you're giving access to a lot of information to the attackers. Now, in this case, we are trying to interface or bring in passwordless from a customer standpoint. Now, what it does for the customer is that A, they don't need to remember passwords, which gives them a seamless, great user experience, right? And at the back end, if there are no credentials to steal, again, breaches are not possible. Now, what it does is that it increases the net promoter score, your customer satisfaction score, which means that you're able to then bring in more services, capabilities to interact with the customer rather than bringing in friction in.